pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers and our hosts. My PowerPoint, just so you know, is a PowerPoint of a quotes page, and not even a complete quotes page. So I appreciate the attention that I'm requiring, given that. Okay, my computer is still starting up, but I think we're ready. In the Institution de Physique, du Châtelet argues against atomism, but argues that the existence of some kind of physical atom is very probable. This strange conjunction seems to fit a standard reading of the Institutions, which divides the work into a broadly Leibnizian metaphysics and a broadly Newtonian physics. After all, du Châtelet's argument against atomism certainly, I say certainly, comes from a monadological place, and her modest admission that a kind of physical atom is very possible in experience renders it very likely sounds rather like Newton's own position on the matter. A closer reading of these texts turns out not to support this standard view, but rather that of Voltaire, which sees du Châtelet as a rather thoroughgoing Leibnizian when writing the Institutions. The admission of physical atoms, though a departure from Leibniz's own thought, is not a concession to Newtonianism, but rather her own novel adaptation of broadly Leibnizian principles. I begin by discussing the standard reading of a Leibnizian-Newtonian synthesis. Many scholars have recently read the Institutions de Physique as a synthesis of Leibnizian metaphysics and Newtonian physics. In her biography, Zinsser describes du Châtelet's Institution as providing a Leibnizian metaphysics in order to supply the metaphysical underpinnings that would answer Newton's European critics. She further describes the Institution as representing an original synthesis of the hypotheses of Newton, the Englishman, Leibniz, the German, and Descartes, the Frenchman. Sarah Hutton also sees the Institution as a Leibniz-Newton synthesis. She writes, the book was written as part of a Newtonian agenda and needs to be read in the context of the promotion of Newton by Voltaire and others. But in spite of being written to introduce Newton's system, Hutton points out something many readers have missed, that the Newtonianism of the Institution de Physique is in fact relatively muted, in her words. There has been some debate concerning the Leibnizianism of the institutions as well. Marius Stan, for instance, argues that du Châtelet's metaphysics is closer to that of Wolff than Leibniz, the main point of departure being the mentality of their simple substances and the resulting idealism. Stan suggests that the Wolffianism of the Institution disproves the standard view that du Châtelet aimed to reconcile Leibnizian metaphysics and Newtonian science. Du Châtelet certainly studied texts from both Leibniz and Wolff. For my purposes here, I'm happy to treat du Châtelet's Leibnizianism as broadly conceived. More interesting for my purposes is Catherine Brading's reading of the Institution, which gives extensive review of the received view in the secondary literature, the Leibniz-Newton synthesis. And while she adheres to the standard reading a bit, saying the synthetic, synthesizing Leibniz and Newton character of the foundations is, I think, beyond dispute, she guards against some dangers that come with it. She writes, I think the approach is problematic, given that such a view encourages us to approach the text with the question, does du Châtelet succeed in providing a Leibnizian foundation for Newtonian physics? Brading is partially concerned that emphasizing the division between the Leibnizianism and the Newtonianism obscures the unity of the text, which she identifies through du Châtelet's unified aim and methodology. And while there is this overarching unity, moving on from the literature to the institution itself, du Châtelet herself divides the institution, as we all know, into two halves. And this division is kind of central to what I want to look at here. Du Châtelet writes, in the first chapters, all very familiar, I'm sure, I explained to you the principal opinions of Monsieur Leibniz on metaphysics. I have drawn them from the works of the celebrated Wolff, whom you've heard me speak of so much with one of his disciples, who was for some time in my household and who sometimes made abstracts for me. Now, I count these first chapters as 1 through 10, covering the principles of our knowledge, contradiction, sufficient reason, the existence of God, essence, attributes, and modes, hypotheses, space, time, the elements of matter, and the nature and properties of bodies. Du Châtelet shifts without comment from these metaphysical chapters to the physical. I make this division because when she asks Maupertuis for comments, she directs him to chapters 11 and beyond, remarking, "I sense that you would counsel me to remove all the metaphysics." This division, of course, is somewhat tenuous, as it should be. Du Châtelet writes that several truths of metaphysics, of physics, metaphysics, and geometry are obviously interconnected. And she is perfectly willing to apply the principle of sufficient reason to our knowledge of the physical world, as well as to the metaphysics. A few more preliminaries. I want to discuss briefly what is atomism. When it comes to atoms, we find in the institution a somewhat strange argument against atomism, which we'll look at shortly. And this occurs in chapter 7 of the Elements of Matter. And then in chapter 9, we find arguments against the infinite divisibility of physical extension. So allow me to state the obvious. To take Du Châtelet's Institution as a coherent, sincere account of her own position, as I do, we must be able to distinguish between atomism and the mere belief in atoms, attenuated atoms. The non-identity of atomism and belief in atoms is familiar. Robert Pascal, for instance, has written that if atomism is just a belief in indivisible atoms, then it should be treated as a thoroughly peripheral issue, and as much as very little turns on whether one thinks the material realm is or is not infinitely divisible. And Pascal identifies 7 theses associated with atomism, noting that atomism can be understood in multiple senses, and that most scholars have fixated too narrowly on the issue of divisibility, which happens to be the issue that I want to discuss. The issue with Du Châtelet is a bit different. She accepts, as we'll see, that there may be atoms, but rejects atomism. The atomism that she rejects must claim more than just that atoms exist. That more is an explanatory role for the atoms to play. What we'll see is that Du Châtelet finds that atoms cannot be the elements of things, and especially that they do not account for the possibility of extension. Atomism, then, is the view that atoms offer the fundamental analysis of the physical world. Brading defines the atomism Du Châtelet rejects as the view that matter ultimately consists of material atoms. As we'll see, Du Châtelet's view is that the physical world may well consist of atoms, but not ultimately. And we'll now turn to the text. Okay. Chapter 7 of the Institution begins with a brief tour of the history of philosophical thinking on the elements of matter. After reviewing the positions of Aristotle and Descartes, who, according to Du Châtelet, identify 4 elements and 3 elements respectively, she turns to treat atomism, which she takes to be the dominant view in her own day. Already in the Institution, Du Châtelet has presented and argued for the principle of sufficient reason as the source of all contingent truths, and praised Leibniz for the way he has used the PSR to establish various other principles and truths. After contrasting atomism and other views of the elements of matter, she writes that Monsieur Leibniz, who never lost sight of the principle of sufficient reason, found that these atoms did not explain extension in matter. And seeking to discover this reason, he believed it could only lie in a different idea of particles, those without extension, which he named monads. Monads are introduced as a 4th view of the elements of matter. But Du Châtelet does not simply argue for monads. She instead carefully presents the views and arguments of Leibniz and Wolff as important contenders, which half of learned Europe has embraced, which deserve serious attention. We'll discuss the distance that she puts between herself and Leibniz, or between herself and monads, in a moment. The argument she provides strikes me as rather unusual, as many of the arguments for familiar theses that du Châtelet provides. The arguments that she gives for familiar theses are just unusual arguments, which is delightful. She does not argue against atoms from their interchangeability or from the necessity that extended things have parts, although that's in there a little bit. Instead, she presents atomism as an attempt to explain why there is extension at all. I quote at length. Okay. Now, as nothing exists without a sufficient reason, it is necessary for this extension to have a sufficient reason that explains how and why it is possible. For saying that there is extension because there are small extended particles comes to saying nothing, since the same question will be asked about these small extended particles as about extension itself, and the sufficient reason for their extension will be asked about in turn. It is necessary to come in the end to something that is without extension, that has no particles, to give a reason for that which is extended and has particles. Now, a being without extension and without particles is a simple being, so compounds, extended beings, exist because there are simple beings. She continues, to have simple beings accepted less reluctantly, the Leibnizians use quite an accurate comparison. And I've searched for the source of this, and I don't exactly see it. My understanding of Wolff is quite limited, but I've looked at a few places. There's too many places to look for Wolff. My knowledge of Leibniz, I feel very, as confident as a Leibniz scholar can, I believe, saying that this argument doesn't appear in Leibniz. So I've looked, and I don't see this argument per se being made quite this way, although she's attributing it to the Leibnizians. If someone asked why there were watches, he certainly would not be content if he was answered, it is because there are watches. But in order to give sufficient reasons, and ones that satisfy the questioner about the possibility of a watch, it would be necessary to come to things that are not watches. That is to say, to springs, to cogwheels, to pinions, to the chain, etc. The same reasoning applies to extension, for when one says that there are bodies with extension because there are atoms, it is as if one says there's extension because there's extension, which is in fact saying nothing at all. My reading of this argument approaches the topic from a decidedly monadological point of view, taken in a broad sense. I'm not committing to the mentality of the simples. So if we prefer simple substances to monads, I'm taking the monad as broad enough to just not make those divisions. Hopefully that's reassuring. The task du Châtelet places before the atomist is one that the atomist would not recognize. Someone who thinks the world of extended beings must be explained in terms of an unextended reality, not just God's decision to create what he knows is to be possible, but an unextended reality, is already a monadologist, the way I use the term. Du Châtelet argues that it isn't just the atomists, but also Descartes, who fails to explain the possibility of extension. Descartes mistakenly follows the pseudo-principle of clear and distinct ideas to claim that, in extension, he had a clear and distinct idea of a body without troubling to prove the possibility of this idea, that we will soon see to be very incomplete, since to the idea of extension must be added the concepts of the force of inertia and of the force vive. Du Châtelet accepts the Leibnizian arguments, then, that the idea of extension only makes sense if grounded in a world of the active and passive forces of simple substances. Extended bodies are made possible by the forces of simple substances. Now I want to discuss the distance that she places in the institution between herself and this description of Leibnizian theses. And I think that, well, we'll see what I think. There's reasons for her besides not accepting the views. There's other reasons for her to place that distance there. And I also have some contentions about, well, we'll see what I say. Both in the institution themselves and in a letter to Maupertuis, du Châtelet distances herself from Leibniz's monads. Few people in France know anything of this opinion of Monsieur Leibniz's but the word monads. I think that itself is a reason for distance between du Châtelet and the monads. It has become a byword for extravagance. The books of the famous Wolff, in which he explains so clearly and eloquently Monsieur Leibniz's system, which in his hands took a totally new form, have not yet been translated into our language. So I'm going to try to explain the ideas of these two great philosophers on the origin of matter, an opinion which half of learned Europe has embraced, which deserves serious attention. The following sections of the text take a decidedly descriptive tone. The distance between the author of the text here I find curious. More troubling perhaps to my interpretation is what du Châtelet writes to Maupertuis. Not there. I wasn't expecting you to become a Leibnizian or for the monads to have made your conquest. I don't know, however, if these metaphysical ideas, which are at the outset of the book, don't merit at least to be better known. Again, this distance. Certainly, with some trepidation that I try to undermine the distance that she's putting there herself, but I see some reason to think that this distance is meant to keep her readership. The excuse that she makes for herself in the institution is the same as the one she makes to Maupertuis, and I think that can give us pause. I suggest that it's with the likes of Maupertuis and Voltaire in mind that she makes her excuse. This is no friendly audience to Leibnizian metaphysics. As du Châtelet herself tells us when she writes to Maupertuis, I sense that you would advise me to remove all the metaphysics. She asks Maupertuis for Maupertuis' comments, as I mentioned, on the work, but only on the physical half of the work, beginning with chapter 11. She doesn't want to know what he thinks of the first 10 chapters. She knows what he'll think of the first 10 chapters. So du Châtelet knows very well that much of the audience of the work for the second half of the institution will be hostile to the first half, and she knows the kind of impact this can have on the estimation of one's work. She laments to Maupertuis of the role nationalism seems to have played in the awarding of the essay prize on the propagation of fire to 3 Cartesian philosophers over her and Voltaire's treatments of the topic. In the institution, she again decries that nationalism plays such an important role in intellectual disputes, writing, "Guard yourself, my son, whichever side you take in this dispute among the philosophers, against the inevitable obstinacy to which the spirit of partisanship carries one. This frame of mind is dangerous on all occasions of life, but it is ridiculous in physics. The search for truth is the only thing in which the love of your country must not prevail." There's more than that, but... And it is surely very unfortunate that the opinions of Newton and of Descartes have become a sort of national affair. About a book of physics, one must ask if it is good, not if the author is English, German, or French. Now she's noting a dispute between Newtonians and Cartesians, but when she talks of nationalities, the Germans are in there too, right? So they slip in there, I think, because of Leibniz and Wolff, being particularly important to her here. Du Châtelet knows that philosophies at that time of nationality. No, the truth does not. And this might seem overly simplistic point to make. We have to remember that one doesn't warn against things that are unusual, right? We warn against things that are common. And here she's warning against nationalistic prejudices against German thinkers. So again, reason for that distance. Besides these social and biographical considerations, it's evident that du Châtelet accepts the principle of sufficient reason as a guide to truth without equivocation. She uses the PSR against Newtonians, for instance, writing, if this philosopher, I'm pretty sure this isn't here, yeah. If this philosopher, Maupertuis, before seeking the reason for the preference of one law of attraction over another, had sought the sufficient reason for the attraction itself, it is probable that he would have recognized that this attraction, as the Newtonians propose it, that is to say, one that makes it a property of matter and the cause of most of the phenomenon, is inadmissible. Since du Châtelet is committed at this time to the PSR and observes that one cannot give a sufficient reason for the existence of atoms, qualified as we'll see, it's hard to interpret her as anything but a Leibnizian, in very broad terms, in this regard. Returning to the distance she places between herself and Leibniz, I might conjecture that it isn't the existence of simple substances that du Châtelet is distancing herself from. It's hard to read the institutions and think that she wants to distance herself from simple substances. But perhaps it's the mental properties of the monads, or Leibniz's accounts of the relationship between the simples and the compounds. Hopefully, it is these that the readers find extravagant, and not the simples themselves. Okay, but now turning to chapter 9, Atoms 2. But du Châtelet does not rule out the existence of physical atoms entirely. In fact, there need to be smallest physical parts, in addition to, and maybe even because of, the monadic simples underneath them. I quote, "It is confusing geometrical extension with physical extension, and in supposing that physical extension is composed of an infinity of extended parts, that the ancients formed those false and specious arguments against the possibility of movement." So besides leading to the xenoparadoxes, du Châtelet gives 4 other reasons for thinking it probable that nature halts the analysis of matter. I tend to find these arguments, I don't read the history of philosophy, it's just reconstructing the arguments, right? I want to reconstruct the text. So I'm going to speed through these 4 arguments rather quickly. The first claims that matter being resolved to infinity would destroy the regularity of like producing like. The second likewise says that infinite divisions would lead to species intermingling and new species constantly being produced. And since new species are not produced, then there can't be these infinite divisions. Third, she says our efforts to dissolve things with burning mirrors and the like would have no limits. That there are limits to what we can do in making these divisions. She finds those limits must come from the opposition of the physical atoms, of the parts, the irreducible parts, irreduced parts. And the fourth one, I quote here, this irresolvability of the first bodies becomes indispensably necessary if one adopts the system of germs which the new discoveries that have been made with the microscope seem to demonstrate. All the world knows those discoveries of Hartsocker, and every day it becomes more likely that nature does not act except through development. If each grain of wheat contains the germ of all the grains of wheat it will produce, it is necessary that the actual divisions of matter have limits, even if those limits are unassignable by us. End quote. Du Châtelet finds that the physical world must be divided into actual parts. Though we can treat the extension of the physical world abstractly and identify an infinity of potential parts in that extension considered abstractly, any physical being must have a fixed number of actual parts. Besides the reasons given above, I contend that one important benefit for positing a kind of atom is to provide robust structural explanations. Robust is hand-wavy. Robust structural explanations. And structural explanations, of course, being a classic feature of atomic theory. She writes, it's not open. Okay. It's not open to say, this watch has 10, it's all about watches. This watch has 10, 100, or 1,000,000 parts. For as a watch, it has one number that constitutes its essence, and it cannot have more or fewer parts and remain a watch. Here, the essence of a thing and also in other passages, the possible movements that it can make, the essence of a thing is identified with its parts, the number of its parts, and clearly, though this isn't in this passage, the arrangement of those parts. Earlier in the institution, she rehearses a critique of scholasticism as lacking explanatory force in a particularly interesting way, for assuming the existence of this vegetative soul does not produce an understanding of why the plant that I'm considering has a particular structure rather than any other, nor how this vegetative soul can give shape to a mechanism such as that of a plant. To understand the plant, it is necessary to understand the structure of its parts. Or rather, not even it is necessary. To understand the plant is just to understand the structure of its parts. For there to be extended parts, we need something like an atom. So while du Châtelet rejects atomism, she does hold that there are limits to the divisions that are made in physical bodies. I quote again. One has seen above that indivisible atoms, or parts of matter, are inadmissible if one considers them as simple, irresolvable, and primitive matters, because one cannot give a sufficient reason for their existence. But as long as one recognizes that they derive their origin from simple beings, one certainly can admit them. For it is very possible, and experience renders it very likely, that there is a certain determinate number of parts of matter in the universe, which nature never resolves into their principle, which remain undivided in the present constitution of this universe, and that all the bodies that compose the universe result from the composition and mixture of these solid particles, so that one can regard them as elements endowed with shapes and internal distinctions that result from their parts. Of course, it must be said that these atoms are quite different from those of the atomists. They're not infinitely hard. They have parts, although those parts are not divided, and they do not exist in a vacuum. But she insists that it is most reasonable to believe that the physical universe can only be divided so far. One finds actual smallest parts that the universe is composed of. Du Châtelet argues for the likelihood of these atoms in part by noting the regularity of the world, which would be much more irregular if things were susceptible to an infinite variety of actual divisions, and in part by associating with germ theory. But in the end, she allows that without experiments to rely on the existence of atoms is only possible, although experience renders it very, very likely. Du Châtelet is here moving away from Leibniz's position. Right? This is an important distinction between her and Leibniz by denying the infinite divisions in the extended world. And Leibniz actually argues that not only is extension infinitely divisible, but there are times in which it's infinitely divided. There's this lovely diagram in the dialogue at the center of Arthur's volume of a circle with a peg in it, and you imagine water flowing around the circle, and since there's less volume here, less space for the water to flow around on the north side than the south side, it's going to be going faster up here and slower down here, and you get a continuum of motions given this varied speed, showing that division has to actually be infinitely made since there's a continuum of speeds. So du Châtelet is very different from Leibniz here in denying the infinite division of the physical world. It's in principle divisible, but it's actually not divided, and that not divided element is rather important. There is another place that she says that something like geometrically the infinite divisibility is absolutely true, and physically it's an error, something along those lines. To sum up and to conclude, in the institution I find a broadly monadological metaphysics that finds the explanation of the very possibility of an extended world in the forces of non-extended simple substances. Du Châtelet's choice of arguments against atomism is, I believe, telling. She clearly rejects various ideas associated with atoms, infinite hardness, and empty space, for instance, but when treating atomism per se, the issue she raises is the inability of the theory to explain the possibility of extension. This allows Du Châtelet's arguments to be compatible enough with atomism that she can ground a robust structural explanation, but perhaps her arguments would even prompt an atomist reader to consider converting, in Voltaire's words, to the religion of monads. Thank you very much.